Thanks so much for joining us for the second edition. We call this Next Up, and we usually talk to community leaders. We're doing that this time around, but we're picking one subject, and that is what happens when someone finds out that he or she is a descendant of a slave owner. And that's the cover story in this week's Riverfront Times. Ray and I are going to be discussing that this half hour, along with Dick Weiss, longtime St. Louis journalist. Good to see you again, Dick, who wrote the cover story.
Good to see you, Charlie.
And we're also joined by Elkin Kistner, who's profiled in this story.
Thank you.
Mr. Kistner, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Ben Phillips. You're also in this story as well, and we'll explain why as we continue on Next Up. Welcome to Next Up.
Thank you.
Well, Dick, why don't we give you a chance to just kind of give our viewers a little overview of this story that takes a look at Mr. Kistner and his kin and the secret that they discovered.
Yeah, well, Charlie, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this story. I am a co-founder of a racial equity storytelling project called Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson, and we have been telling the stories of St. Louis families across generations. And most of the time, we focused on African-American families and the challenges that they faced in a difficult racial environment. But I came upon the Kistner family through friends, and I was just really fascinated with what they were going through. They had learned that a long time ago, they learned that they were descendants of some prominent and lionized St. Louisans. One was Moses Linton, who was a founder of the Jesuit Society. He's a physician, and was very prominent in St. Louis at the time of the cholera epidemic and saved many lives. And on Elkin's side of the family, on his maternal side, he is also a descendant of John Gain O'Brien, who was also a physician and also prominent about the same time in political circles and educational circles. There's a school on the north side named for him. What they didn't know until recently is that both those men were slaveholders. And when they learned this, they were dismayed. And that's where the story sort of takes off from there. And I was fascinated to find out, well, what were they going to do with this knowledge?
Which I guess brings us to you, Mr. Kistner. How did you find out that your relatives, Moses Linton and John Bryan, were slaveholders?
It was about 2017. I have a cousin, Boo Kistner Henderson now, who kind of, as the article describes, Dick did a magnificent job, I think, of kind of laying out the evolution. But the short version is, Boo just kind of became suspicious, started investigating, had a friend who is a part-time genealogist at the St. Louis County Library, which I never knew has a very deep set of resources in genealogy. And this woman Kelly Draper, was able to pull together some census records that showed that Moses Linton owned 7 slaves. And we kind of convened a family meeting because we had all kind of grown up looking at Moses Linton depicted in the mosaic tiles of the new cathedral.
Wow.
No mention made of any negative history of any sort. He was a remarkable man. The shorthand description is I think of him as kind of a minor league, maybe rookie league version of Thomas Jefferson, and so over time, my brother and I in particular, really started digging, just kind of as amateur. He's a journalist, I'm a lawyer. We've both done various types of research over the course of our careers. And it was really Rocky who a couple of years ago found out about John Gain O'Brien on my mother's side, and he escaped history. He used to beat the heck out of people who would report about him. And he was a very prominent anti-abolitionist who accumulated great wealth, and nobody knows where it went. He was a very powerful man, and literally historians have just learned about him recently. So this has been a really kind of a very unusual evolution for us, and that's where we are, and we just want to make sure that we are not complicit in concealing information about people who have kind of this minor league Thomas Jeffersonian duality. It's never been revealed publicly as far as we can tell. And so let me, do you mind if I segue
Sure.
to Ben?
Yeah.
So I'm sorry,
No,
you know, I had the good fortune of starting my career as a lawyer in the city councilor's office. And when that happens, regardless of whether you start off as I did, going to a Tony high school like Burroughs and going to, you know, a semi, you know, kind of potted Ivy League college, you know, you go in the city councilor's office and you rub elbows with all kinds of different people. And Ben and I became acquainted. I had the good fortune of representing Ben and some similarly, in my opinion, victimized individuals in 2 fairly prominent lawsuits. I don't know, Ben and I think, kind of evolved from client lawyer to friends. And so when this knowledge evolved on my family's part, I reached out to a couple of African American friends to try to get a reaction from them and a feeling as to how they felt about me and others in my family knowing about this, and help in what kind of effort we should make based on the fact that we now had this knowledge. And
Ben Phillips is helping facilitate these discussions within your family. Is that right?
Much, yes.
So
he is deeply involved with multiple members of my family now.
Yeah, and I happen to know one of them. Rachel was an intern at KMOX back in the day, and she's included in this story. But they're in the story some familiar names that people will find. And so, Ben, you sit down with the Kistners and the Hendersons and others, and you kind of go over what they're thinking, because there's some shock and there's also some shame, as it turns out, attached to this revelation.
Definitely, it was both. We sat down, I think it was kind of near Thanksgiving, about 5 years ago, at Boo's house, Boo McLaughlin, Henderson now. And there were about 7 of the relatives there, 7 or 8. And we started talking about, we know this information, what should we do with it? And that's what they were saying. And we said, well, you know, first of all, you're going to have to come clean and let people know what's going on. Can't hold anything back. If you hold anything back, people are going to discredit you. So you got to get out there and put your family out there. I said, it's going to be tough. And I talked with especially Elkin and his brother and said, look, this is going to be the toughest thing you've ever done in your life, to say your great-grandfather was a slave owner and not get the lashing from the public that you're probably going to get. So I told them they have to be tough, they have to be strong to do this. And they listened to us. And it was me and 2 other African Americans at the table at the time, a young lady, Chelsea Carter, and a young man, Damian L. Smith, who lives in Los Angeles, but he's a former St. Louis resident. And we talked several times. And there were some tough discussions, and there were some tough discussions that we were not a part of, because when they get together like for a barbecue or something, the subject came up. I heard about them, but I was not present at some of it. But there had to be some real tough, you know, attitudes going.
Well, you talked about in your piece, which was excellent, I think you used the phrase vast re-remembering. How vast is it, and how vast should it be?
Well,
on this topic of...
This is going on across the country, and is going on within families, and it's going on within institutions. St. Louis University is taking more of a intensive look at its past. The Archdiocese is doing this as well. A lot of this also grew up around Georgetown University, where Rocky is now living, in terms of the Jesuits and slaves. And a lot of families, as the Kistners have discovered, have looked into this. Some of them don't want to talk about it. They just said, well, let's just move on or not mention it. But others have looked into this. There's a family, I believe, in Georgia that have done essentially the same thing that the Kistners have done, and have tried to find out who are the descendants of the slaves that their ancestors had, and what can they do for them? Can they help them in some way? And so, and it's interesting because there's also, as you know, a pushback around this whole idea of what is essentially reparations. And there are a lot of folks who are saying, well, let's not get into this, it's divisive, and let's talk about something else. And then they bring in the critical race theory sorts of things, which is sort of a red herring, particularly in regard to this conversation. And so it's vast, it's going on in a lot of places, and the thing I think that's interesting in terms of the way the Kistners are going about it is they are trying to not only shed light on what's going on with their family, but also taking steps that are not divisive, bringing in a community of people, African Americans and conservative leaning whites who are really just interested in, well, what's the truth? And what can we do going forward? So for instance, Judge David Mason is an African American, but he was appointed by a Republican governor. And so he has respect of conservatives, and he's supporting this effort. And so they're going about it, I think, in a kind of a very smart way, and trying to keep it, I don't know, a little bit above and beyond politics, and really talking about families and community.
And you know, you should know, we talked about it toward the end of our show earlier in the program, and I think I brought up the red herring of critical race theory. But I think I think the question is, you know, I think the panel, I know the panel generally feels that the spirit of reparations are the right thing to do. The question is the practicality of it, and in the case of somebody that might be able to identify their own family heritage, I'm curious what kind of, to the extent you've been public, and I congratulate you for that, what kind of response have you gotten?
Well, first of all, it's been about a 24-hour public awareness since the articles come out. So it's extremely limited, but it's been divided. Some of it has been, a little bit of it has been pretty much of an attack. Some of it has been very supportive.
An attack?
You know, one of the attack emails came from somebody who's a prominent attorney who's conservative, who we've known for a long time, and he just strongly disagrees with exploring this area. Another one was a guy known from City Hall who is now, I think, I don't know whether he's a lobbyist. He's some sort of consultant, and African-American guy who said, that's great, and we're going to have a beer next Tuesday afternoon and talk more. You know, my view of this is, and this is just my personal view, is that I am not an expert on policy. I don't know what the next step should be. I do know that keeping concealed from the public information about people in their past is flat out wrong. None of us should be complicit in it. I mean, would those critics who think that we have done thus far was to just ask for more information to be given about our ancestors and a past and attributes that they had that we think everybody would find beyond unsavory. That's all we've asked for. And it seems to me that with Judge Mason's initiative, with the law library, which is an amazing facility, which is underutilized, places like that where you can conduct learning, there is an African-American neighborhood less than a mile away from where my office is now on North Broadway. And it is the intersection of Gano Street and Lee Avenue. So Gano Street is named after my ancestor, who is a prominent anti-abolitionist, and Lee is named after a particular general. And a utility worker came through my office to do an inspection a couple of weeks ago. I asked him where he lived. We were having a conversation. He lives in that neighborhood, right at that intersection. It's a 100% African-American neighborhood, and they have no knowledge whatsoever as to what those street names are and what they mean. Nobody's ever informed them. I'm not talking about street name changes, but it seems to me like the community should be able to come together and say, well, we should at least educate the public as to why these places are named what they are, and if there is a history to them that is tainted, to make the information available. There are ways to do that that would make the St. Louis community distinguished among all communities in the nation and getting ahead of that. And I don't know how people can oppose providing information.
Right.
You might
No,
want to talk
no.
about what the law library would do.
Let's get into that in just a moment.
Sure.
Because I think that's important. But for you, if you don't mind me jumping in, you didn't know your great-great-grandfather, of course. You're not responsible for his actions. Right. What he did, it's nothing to do with your life whatsoever, does it? I mean,
yeah, I mean, obviously one can't make one's ancestor or influence what the ancestor did. That isn't going to happen. So that's an area that I have not yet focused on. I think it's a very interesting kind of factual, policy-based discussion that needs to be had. One, neither my brother nor I, nor any of my relatives, right, at least relatives in the States, are what I would consider to be real wealthy. But compared to people who grew up like Ben did in Mill Creek and then Pruitt-Igoe, I got to go to a Tony High School. I got to go to a potted Ivy League college. I got to become a lawyer. Now, is that attributable somehow to cascading wealth over generations that enabled me to do those things? Perhaps. And I think, you know, you look now, the people who are in charge of policy, the electorate in the city of St. Louis, voted in Tashara Jones. She ran on a campaign of promoting reparations, and now there's a voluntary reparations program that check off on the real estate bills, I think, is about to go into law. I think that's for them to decide and educate us. But this is something that can be done that enables us to take advantage of just getting information out there in a way that brings the community together.
and you are establishing some scholarships as well as a informational library in the Civil Courts building, which will help people explore these issues.
What they're doing on the front burner is seeking to have the law library be kind of a base of information where people, young people, genealogists, families could go to research the past and bring to light whatever they want about slaveholding in St. Louis. People have discussed, in general, the idea of, well, creating scholarships for the ancestors, the descendants of slaveholders. That is something that is, you know, kind of an idea that has been done. And what you do, your family could put some money in, and then invite other people to participate in it. So it isn't like one family needs to bear the burden of scholarships for all. Now, if a particular family were billionaires, maybe they could do that, but that's typically not done.
I've got a question for you, Ben, and that is, how do you, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say we're disconnected completely. I mean, we are a product of generations, and as I say, I think it's terrific that you're willing, in your case, to at least be public about it and talk about it candidly. How do you view that? I mean, do you think that I certainly, it sounds like some of the negatives you're getting are people who are upset with you for talking about this, actually? Is that what you're saying?
I really hope they just don't understand.
Right,
Ray.
but I want to know what you think about that, about how connected should we feel?
Well, first of all, the people who are contacting Elkin and someone like Elkin in his position about doing some things to open up the education and the knowledge of slavery, they don't look like me, first off.
Right.
So, but people have to understand that wealth in this country was built on the backs of slaves and slave owners. You know, to this day, the prison system is even a form of slavery, and they utilize it through prison industries to promote and get wealth for people, especially the private prisons. Mm-hmm. So, my attitude is, if Elkin and his family can do anything, educate or whatever, I think it's a step in the right direction, because I have not seen a lot of that in this country, and definitely not in the city of St. Louis.
Right.
So I agree with them to do what they want to do or how they want to do it. They're going to do something. They just haven't worked out the particulars.
Elkin, how difficult is it for you to come out and publicly express your family's history?
You know, I think part of it, as a lawyer, you know, you have to step up to the plate and swing. You're going to strike out sometimes. You're not going to win every case. It really, my brother and I are quite close, and it was a number of years ago, really in consultation with Ben, that we just decided, you know, this information is not getting out. We can't sit on it, and we're going to do what is necessary to make sure it gets out. And at that point in time, it just became a matter of resolve. And once you've made a resolution that you're going to get up and do something, then, you know, the uncertainty's behind you. Whether you lose or win, that's fine, you know, but you've tried. And so it's not that hard. I look forward to the things that really intrigue me about trying to do projects that would bring the community together. I want to emphasize, I don't speak for the board of the Law Library. I'm excited about the prospects that Judge Mason has brought to us in terms of the Freedom Suit project, joining with the Law Library to basically revitalize a beautiful facility. I don't know who's been there, and cause it to have you know, greater vitality, and to perhaps bridge some of this gulf by bringing people together.
Well, David Mason's a great guy. I don't mean to hurt his reputation by saying so, but I think he'll forgive me. I know. And I think, if I can speak for Caucasians, none of us has any, there's no way any white person can be really judgmental and say, well, because in Missouri in particular, and to some extent in St. Louis, it's a coin toss. If you know, we all have ancestors. I found mine. I wrote about this several. He was my great-grandfather. I think it was great-great-grandfather Ignaz Hartmann, who was turned out to be a little bit of a Civil War hero. Well, it was great that he was on the right. I was so relieved to find out he was on the Union side, but there wasn't any predicting that. I mean, it worked out fine. I had thought I'd come from a long line of cowards, but it turns out he was actually a pretty good guy, and a really bad writer, so that made sense. But he. His stuff's in the Smithsonian. He wrote some notes and stuff. But my point is, nobody really has any, you know, position to judge. I mean, we had Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice, who wrote the worst decision in history. We all talk about Dred Scott. We have a county name for this guy. It's in Taney County in Missouri. So we have a lot of this. But I think it's really, what do you see, any of you, as kind of the next steps, though, that would be practical, that recognize everybody's sensitivities about this?
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger on a couple of things. One is there are individual family members and things like that, but we're all beneficiaries of systems that were created on the backs of slaves and largely by white people, and we may not be guilty personally, but we should all be accountable for those systems. And our job as journalists, I know you feel this, and you do as well as Charlie, is to shed light on matters and then leave it to the intelligence and the goodwill of people to begin to figure it out. If you don't have, if you're not dealing with a set of facts to help you with that, then you're lost. And that's what I think that Elkin and his family have gone about this in a kind of a very appropriate, methodical, thoughtful way. Let's shed light on this and then leave it to the community to figure it out.
And you know, it would be great if there were other families doing the same thing.
Right.
There are families that are actively trying to hide this past, and they know that they at least should bring to bear that their family participated in slavery.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's a it's one thing to say you're disconnected, but to do that, I think that's where you need journalists to feel free to say, hey, you know, I mean, particularly to the extent it's publicly available information.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're enjoying increasing popularity everybody's believing what we write. So,
Yeah.
Sure. Ray, to pick up on next steps, I mean, you mentioned Taney County. I mentioned the intersection of Lee and Gano. I would challenge you to look at what we think we can produce as an interactive map of all examples like that across the community. Think about the practical reality, and I think this can be proven, that practically every extant brick structure that we see today in the St. Louis metropolitan area, constructed between 1800 and 1865, the date of the time of emancipation, was built using enslaved people labor.
Wow.
And if you were to build an interactive map with the Taney County, the Gano and Lee intersections, all of the brick buildings, and you were to then visualize just how pervasive this fabric is, how tightly woven it is, and think about the naming of these places after men and women, probably all men actually, who enslaved people, and the buildings that still stand that were constructed utilizing it. I think it would challenge people.
Elkin, we have to cut you off there because time is limited. In fact, we're out of it. So thank you, Elkin Kistner, Ben Phillips, Dick Weiss for joining us for Next Up. Ray, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9PBS.